Today, we view southern China as synonymous with China itself. Up until recent decades, the window for the world to peer into Chinese culture was largely viewed through a Cantonese lens, with the Cantonese language and culture proliferating throughout the Western world, much more so than the northern counterparts of Mandarin culture, which was hidden behind the bamboo curtain for nearly half a century. But if we rewind into the distant past, southern China, particularly Canton, was far from being anything recognizable as China. It was a land and people perceived as wild and untamed to the Chinese, perhaps something akin to how Gaul was perceived by the Romans. So how is it that given the history of China dates back over 5,000 years, and Canton, a province that was only truly incorporated into Imperial China less than 1,000 years ago, and never really held any seats of political power, became perhaps the most influential province in China's modern history, superseding historically political and financial centers like Beijing, Nanjing, Tianjin, Xi'an, and Shanghai. A Canton-born coalition ultimately became the first post-dynastic government to end the warlord era and govern China's first unified republic. How did this unlikely corner of China lead the way to this happening? Well, let's talk about it, brah. In order for us to understand how Canton became positioned to become such an influential region in China, we need to look back at China's origins. Chinese historians categorize the chapters of their history into dynasties, with each dynasty representing one line of hereditary rulers by blood or alliance. Pre-imperial China begins with the semi-mythical Xia dynasty around 2070 BCE, centered in modern-day Henan province. This is followed by the Shang, the Western Zhou, then the Eastern Zhou. Anyone outside these dynastic borders were considered barbarians to the Han Chinese. It is in 221 BCE that China enters into the imperial era, where Qing Shi Huang is the first to unite the kingdoms in the Yellow River Basin, creating the first empire in China under the Qing dynasty, laying the foundation for what many consider the concept of what we call China today. In fact, the name China that the majority of the Western world still uses today comes from the Persian name for the Qing dynasty, Qin. But the Qing borders don't really look much like our idea of China. Where's the entire southern half of the country? One thing that stands out from our mapping out of China's history up through this point is that pre-imperial China's 2,000-year history is centered entirely around the Yellow River Basin, the cradle of the Far East civilization. The concept of China and identifying as Chinese has not yet permeated into the majority of the borders of China today, particularly in the south, which currently makes up about half of China's total population. Entering into Chinese chronicles from around 1000 BCE through the tail end of the first millennium AD, there existed a vast region the Chinese called Baiyue, or 100 Yue, describing the great number of ethnically Yue tribal states that existed in what is now modern-day Southeast China and northern Vietnam. In reality, the Yue were not one homogeneous group of people. Different regions had distinct dialects and cultures that often grew into powerful tribal kingdoms. Unfortunately, the pre-Chinese Yue left behind no written language as far as we know, so their history was narrated from a Chinese perspective, who categorized them as one group of peoples based on a few cultural similarities. Most notably their blackened teeth, headstrong women, tattooed faces, and seafaring and shipbuilding skills, which allowed them to create a Yue diaspora throughout Southeast Asia long before the Chinese began their southbound conquests. Their abilities on the high seas would later play a very important role in shaping our story of Canton, which we will touch more on later. Interestingly, the ethnic majority of Vietnam today still identify as Yue, translated into Vietnamese as Viet, hence the name Viet or Yue in Chinese, and Nam, meaning south in Vietnamese, combining to mean Southern Yue. This is the last surviving predominantly ethnically Yue nation in the world. In the 3rd century BCE is where we enter into the first chapter of China's direct political and military relationship with Baiyue. The Qing dynasty, under China's first emperor, has over 500,000 imperial soldiers dispatched throughout Baiyue to civilize the Barbarians to the south. One of the leaders of the campaign is a General Zhao Tuo, born in modern-day Hebei, over 1,000 miles away from his homeland to the north. Zhao and his men enter a foreign land, describing the Yue as having short hair, tattoos, fine swords, and naval prowess. They describe the land as hot and humid for the majority of the year, being regularly pounded by violent storms and beset by disease and wild animals. The Qing army relished many successful campaigns over the decades, conquering various Yue tribes as far south as modern-day central Vietnam and Hainan Island. Back in the capital city Shenyang, modern-day Xi'an, however, the Qing dynasty begins to splinter. In 210 BCE, after the death of the first emperor, civil wars begin to ignite, and when his son and heir is assassinated in 207 BCE, the empire is officially in collapse. The entire Yellow River Basin devolves into anarchy. Zhao, hearing the news of chaos throughout the empire and having just conquered much of the Canton region, takes this opportunity to found a new kingdom, Nanyue, declaring himself emperor of these new southern lands. His success in maintaining his rule can largely be attributed to his willingness to ally with local chiefs, peacefully coexisting with them and allowing the Yue to continue to practice their local customs. Also encourages his soldiers and Chinese settlers to take on local Yue women as wives. This was a far stretch from the emperor who built China's first empire off of the edge of the sword through fear and subjugation. Ancient historian Sima Qian writes of Qing Shi Huang,
"Any captured opposition was castrated in order to mark them as his slaves. If the Qing should ever get his way with the world, then the world will end his prisoner."
While Nanyue would take over another millennium to be fully assimilated into Imperial China, historians mark Zhao's founding of the kingdom as the official incorporation of the Yue into China's direct geopolitical arena, having an ethnically Chinese ruler that was recognized by multiple Chinese kingdoms, including the fast-growing Han, the successor to the Qing. Nanyue's independence as a kingdom was short-lived, however, as the Han Dynasty gradually emerges as the new ruling power of China, and Nanyue once again rejoins the fold of Imperial China in 179 BCE. This was, however, all but an empty gesture to avoid war, as Zhao Tuo continues to declare himself Emperor of Nanyue until his death. Zhao Tuo's great-great-grandson, Emperor Zhao Xing, closely monitoring the continued growth of Han China and reading the writing on the wall, seeks to formally join the empire and surrender his crown and submit to the one true emperor. But before doing so, Zhao Xing is assassinated by his prime minister Lu Jia, a zealous separatist who takes power. Emperor Wu, enraged by the treasonous actions of Lu Jia, who has essentially ruined the prospect of a peaceful annexation of Nanyue, dispatches 100,000 imperial soldiers south and quickly destroys Nanyue forces, establishing Han rule over the entire region in less than a year, ending 93 years of Nanyue independence. Lu Jia flees further south and is captured in what is now northern Vietnam. They catch his ass, rough him up a bit, and send his head to the Han Emperor. Emperor Wu is so stoked about his gift, he founds a county upon lands he happens to be traveling through and names it Huojia, translated to capturing Lu Jia, which is still the county's name today. For the next 1,200 years, various Chinese dynasties and kingdoms seek to gradually Sinify Nanyue, introducing with them Chinese writing, engineering, science, art, and agricultural technology. Hey, K-Tao, friend? Want to learn to write in Chinese? Nah, not really. Shut the f*** up and grab that brush and paper. In 997 AD, during the Song Dynasty, that Guangdong, the eastern expanse, is finally given its modern name. The Sinification of Canton greatly intensifies as the era of the dominance of the semi-nomadic kingdoms of the north begins, wreaking havoc on the sedentary agricultural populations of China. The Juchen of the Jing Dynasty captures the Baisong capital, at which is now Kaifeng, forcing hundreds of thousands of Song Chinese to migrate south to escape war. In 1205, an even greater southern migration is sparked by perhaps the most impactful war in human history, the Mongol conquest of Eurasia. The Song court moves its capital to Hangzhou and bring with them millions of refugees fleeing as far south as possible. Finally, the last great southern migration was the fall of the Ming Dynasty, where the Manchurians in the north start a southbound conquest of China in 1618. Unlike many regions closer to the capitals of Imperial China, Canton was politically part of the empire, but remained culturally independent in many ways, even into the last few centuries. Local populations continued to identify as Yue and maintain local traditions. The Yue language stemming from the Austroasiatic family, which is currently spoken in modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, India, Myanmar, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Nepal, shares no common linguistic ancestry with Chinese, which stems from the Sino-Tibetan language family. Today, Cantonese is considered an official dialect of Chinese, but is also considered a substrate language by many linguists, where intrusive Chinese influences local Yue, combining to become Cantonese. Many Cantonese words with Yue origins cannot be translated into Mandarin. Instead, Cantonese borrows Chinese characters with the closest phonetic sound to represent their own native words, despite the meaning in Mandarin being different. For example, this character, pronounced meh in Cantonese, is a particle word used at the end of sentences to convey doubt or surprise. But translated into Mandarin, mia is simply an onomatopoeia describing the sound a goat makes. For generations following Zhao Tuo's founding of Nanyue, there remained a clear schism between the minority ruling political class and the majority Yue peasant class. The Chinese spoke Chinese, dressed in Chinese attire, and practiced Chinese customs, while the natives spoke Yue and practiced local traditions. According to ancient and middle-aged Chinese scholars, Nanyue was a semi-civilized frontier where disgraced officials were sent into exile. At the same time, Guangdong, particularly its largest city, Canton or Guangzhou, was regarded as a prosperous land along a tropical frontier, rich in oranges, banyan, bananas, and lychee fruits. The city is filled year-round with Indian, Persian, Arab, Sri Lankan, Malay, and even Roman traders and explorers. For any traveler from the south or the west, Guangdong was geographically the shortest distance to China. For 1,000 years, Guangdong truly was the gateway between China and the rest of the world. During the Ming Dynasty, there began periods of imperial edicts forbidding trade with foreign barbarians, mainly as a means for deterring Japanese piracy, which was a major issue during this era. While somewhat successful up China's central and northern seaports, the smuggling business was booming in Guangdong. The Ming Dynasty was unable to take full control of their southern frontier province. This fact is backed clearly by the influx of Chinese tea imports into Europe through the Portuguese and the Dutch, starting with a few hundred kilos per year in the early 1500s to hundreds of metric tons per year by the late 1600s, even during China's bans on foreign trade. Despite several imperial bans on trade specifically against the Portuguese in the first half of the 1500s, local Cantonese officials would regularly accept bribes, or rent as they would call it, in silver from the Portuguese to allow them to conduct business in a small harbor near Guangzhou. Eventually, the Ming came to terms that they were unable to stop illegal trade with the Portuguese and allowed them to turn their harbor into a settlement that could officially be taxed by the Ming court. This settlement would eventually become the permanent Portuguese colony Macau for the next 400 years. A dynasty later in the 19th century, the British would begin sharing the same insatiable lust for Chinese goods that the Portuguese and Dutch had monopolized for decades.
Would you like a cup of tea?
Yeah, sure.
Would you like a cup of tea? Go on, have a cup of tea.
Thank you very much.
I want you to have a cup of tea. Because I have nothing to say about this matter except to offer you some tea.
Okay.
And like 1,000 years prior, the gateway to China was still Canton. Unlike the Ming, however, the policies were enacted to protect the fragile new ethnically Manchu-ruled dynasty over a predominantly Han Chinese empire. For centuries after the ascension of the Qing, Separatist Ming loyal movements remained strong, sometimes financed by Europeans aiming to destabilize a unified China, and often started through maritime attacks. These isolationist decrees, while more successful than the Ming before them, were still proving difficult to enforce in Canton's Pearl River Delta. In response to rampant smuggling, in 1757, China eventually resorts to the Canton system, confining all non-Russian foreign business to Guangzhou, so trade with the Europeans could be better regulated. Much like the present day, the problem for Westerners was that there was a trade deficit with China. Porcelain and tea were some of the hottest commodities in Europe, but the Chinese cared little for European products, so silver was funneling into China on a one-way street. In response, the British came up with an unethical yet ingenious solution: get the Chinese hooked on opium grown in their Indian colonies. Chinese emperors implemented 4 different bans on opium in the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet opium dens and the number of users grew year by year. By 1830, there was estimated to be over 100 Cantonese smuggling boats operating out of Guangzhou port. As mentioned earlier, the Yue were masters of their waters long before the Chinese arrived, and no emperor's edicts were going to stop them from sailing. The Qing Emperor Dao Guang, upon realizing that members of his own court were addicted to opium, decides drastic measures need to be taken. Not only was this a moral crisis for his people, but China was no longer the benefiting party in the trade deficit with the West. Silver was now pouring out of China at a rate never before seen, as prices skyrocketed with the ever-increasing demand for opium. A government official, Ling Zexu, advises the emperor and his court.
The opium trade is a moral issue and an evil that has to be eliminated by any means possible. If we cannot suppress the trade of opium and addiction to it, the Chinese Empire will have no peasants to work the land, no townsfolk to pay taxes, no students to study, and no soldiers to fight. Instead of targeting the opium users, we should stop and punish the pushers who import and sell the drug in China.
After several pleas to British diplomats and representatives of the British East India Company to help enforce China's ban on opium falls on deaf ears, Emperor Dao Guang orders a crackdown on opium. Their main focus is, of course, Guangzhou and the Pearl River Delta. Over 1,600 Chinese smugglers are arrested, many of whom are swiftly executed. Stockpiles of opium at warehouses and even on European vessels are confiscated. It is estimated that within 6 weeks, foreign merchants hand over 20,000 chests filled with 2.6 million pounds of opium, which Chinese officials mix with salt and lime and dump into the bay.
It was terrible, terrible.
At this point, the Qing are royally pissed. These British bastards just don't listen. All trade with British vessels are halted, and the Portuguese are pressured to expel the Brits from Macau. The now stranded British are ultimately forced to settle on Hong Kong Island, a pivotal moment in the history of Sino-Anglo relations. Lord Palmerston, Britain's foreign minister, states,
Conflict between China and Britain is inevitable. On one side is a corrupt, decadent, caste-ridden despotism with no desire or ability to wage war, which relied on custom much more than force for the enforcement of extreme privilege and discrimination, and which is blinded by a deep-rooted superiority complex into believing that they could assert their supremacy over Europeans without possessing military power. On the other side is the most economically advanced nation in the world, a nation of pushing, bustling traders, of self-help, free trade, and the pugnacious qualities of John Bull.
Chinese troops using antiquated guns and cannons and with limited naval ships meet the British in the waters outside the Delta. Dozens of Chinese officers commit suicide when they fail to repel the British. It is an absolute beatdown. China, humiliated by the supposed inferior barbarians of the West, is for the first time humbled to the idea that the Middle Kingdom might not actually be at the center of the world. Yo, we ain't the best? Nope, maybe never was. Under the Treaty of Nanking, Hong Kong is ceded to the British in 1842, to which it would remain a colony for the next century and a half. It is through this colony that Western ideas and philosophy would seep into China and spark perhaps the most important change in China's history since Qing Shi Huang united the kingdoms of the Yellow River Basin 2,000 years prior. In the remainder of the 19th century, China further suffers once more a devastating loss to Britain in the Second Opium War, signing another unfair treaty, and perhaps even more humiliating, in 1895, in the First Sino-Japanese War, gets their asses handed to them by Japan, who was once but a lowly tributary state to China. It is now clear to the Chinese populace that desperate change needs to take place, or China may be carved to pieces within a generation. The Qing dynasty, however, has a different outlook on the situation. While foreign powers are undoubtedly a major concern, civil unrest was becoming their most serious threat as the citizens began to doubt the dynasty's ability to effectively lead China. Silencing political activism was becoming the imperial court's primary agenda. The Qing government's reputation was tarnished during the tough times. We're talking right in the middle of an era the Chinese referred to as the century of humiliation. Famines, economic downturn, and military defeats to the west were creating intense disdain towards the Manchu ethnic minority rulers of the Qing, particularly in one province, and you guessed it, Canton. Influence from European colonizers and Christian missionaries were the most concentrated in Canton, bringing with them Western ideas and religion. With the ever-increasing disapproval of the government, many Chinese began looking towards the West for guidance, particularly amongst the poor and uneducated, who can no longer afford to lease land with rising costs of living accompanied by a stagnant economy. Canton becomes a hotbed for political activism, with Qing corruption and banditry at all-time highs. Secret militant societies like the Triads begin forming with a focus on overthrowing the Qing dynasty. The Qing's control over Canton and much of southern China weakens day by day. Hong Huo, a poor Hakka Cantonese villager, who after failing the imperial civil service examination 4 times, kinda reminiscent of Hitler's rise to power, no? Begins preaching that he is the brother of Christ and grows a cult following. Huo dreams of turning China into a paradise by eliminating the Manchu oppressors and restructuring China back under Han Chinese rule. Again, reminiscent of Hitler with his racist goals of creating a better world by eliminating a minority ethnic group. He pushes north and takes Nanjing at the height of the rebellion, expands to command a population base of 30 million people. This war is known as the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest wars in human history that you've probably never even heard of. Some estimates put the death toll at up to 44 million, making it per capita the single deadliest war at over 3.5% of the world's population killed. More deadly than even the world wars. This war was unique up to this point in China's history in being a northward invasion from Canton, as opposed to the province's long history of being invaded and colonized by the north. Most of the Taiping soldiers were of Yue descent. Hong and his followers had an intense vendetta towards the Manchu that would make any genocidal maniac proud. It'd make American racial tensions seem like a campfire s'mores party on a warm summer night. He preached that the Manchus were devils on earth, and creating a paradise was impossible so long as the Manchus breathed life. Every city the Taiping took, they would massacre all Manchu men and children, then would take the women out of the city walls and burn them alive. This was not a good time to be rocking that Manchu Q hairstyle. After nearly 15 years of fighting, the Qing, with the support of the majority of the Western powers, would decisively reconquer their southern lands with brutal vengeance. No Hakka Cantonese were permitted to surrender. All were sentenced to death. Nearly all the captured Taiping leaders were executed by slow slicing. During the height of the Qing push south, it is estimated that approximately 30,000 Hakka Cantonese were executed per day. Although the Qing ended the war as the victor, the Taiping Rebellion marked a paramount shift of power within China. The legitimacy of Manchu rule was brought into question, not only within China, but internationally as well. Beijing's grasp over the southern half of their empire was teetering on the edge, and the Chinese populace could smell blood. The earliest revolutionary organization in Hong Kong was the Fu Ren Literary Society. they created the first ever Chinese manhua, or manga in Japanese, that wrote political satire criticizing Qing China. One of the all-Cantonese members, Ce Tan Tai, would later go on to found the South China Morning Post in 1903, a Hong Kong newspaper outlet that is attributed to being a vital agitator in stirring the reform movements throughout late Qing China. Protected by British freedoms of press, countless other important actors in leading the overthrow of the Qing dynasty were born and raised in or around Hong Kong. But most notable of all was Sun Yat-sen. Born in 1866 in Cuiheng, later renamed in his honor to Zhongshan, the Mandarin name for Yat-sen. He attended primary school in Guangdong before moving to Hawaii until the age of 17. Much like himself, many of the revolutionaries Sun surrounded himself with were Cantonese men with foreign educations. Sun is credited for the funding and financing of the revolutions, and for keeping the spirit of revolution alive, even after a series of failed uprisings. His successful merger of minor revolutionary groups to a single larger party provided a base for all those who shared the same ideals of reframing China's antiquated dynastic government. Shortly after the successful Xinhai Revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, Sun was elected the provisional president. The reality, though, was that Sun's Nationalist Party was but one political group vying for power following the fall of the Qing dynasty. This period between 1916 and 1928 was known as the Warlord era, where at its height there were as many as 16 independent military factions operating within China. In terms of international recognition, whoever controlled Beijing, the last capital of the fallen Qing, had some legitimate claim to rule. Sun's Kuomintang party, which was headquartered in Canton, seemed an unlikely candidate to gain international recognition because, as we mentioned, Canton historically never held much political weight in China, being a frontier province so far from the Yellow River Basin. With the support of the southern warlords, foreign financiers, and possessing the most modern and organized military, Sun's nationalists have a decisive advantage over its adversaries. Sun continued traveling throughout Asia, advocating for a peaceful reunification of China, all the way until his death from liver cancer in 1925. Under the command of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, Sun's protege, the nationalists organized a military campaign from Guangdong to take over the northern half of China and legitimize his position against the Baiyue government in Beijing. This war is known as the Northern Expedition, again echoing the theme of the Taiping Rebellion, where we see a successful northward invasion originating in Canton. The Baiyue government is officially dismantled, and the United States leads the major world powers in being the first to recognize Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party as the legitimate government of China, and China's capital is moved from Beijing to Nanjing. This was also short-lived, of course, as Chiang's Nationalist Party would later lose the Chinese Civil War to the Communists in 1949. Fleeing to Taiwan, where the Republic of China still governs today. Sun Yat-sen remains unique among 20th century Chinese leaders for having a high reputation in both mainland China and Taiwan. In Taiwan, he is seen as the father of the Republic of China and is known by the name Father of the Nation. In mainland China, Sun is highly regarded as the forerunner of the revolution that overthrew dynastic China. Mao Zedong is quoted,
"Let us pay tribute to our great revolutionary forerunner, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He bequeathed us much that is useful in the sphere of political thought."
Now that we've covered the history of Guangdong, we can begin to piece together how its background brought us to where we are today. The Pearl River Delta, which is comprised of Guangzhou, Macau, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen, having been China's gateway to the world for 1,000 years, has deep foreign roots that predates the last two dynasties that no emperor was ever able to fully uproot. Despite continued attempts from Canton's counterparts to the north at closing China's borders to outside thoughts, Canton forever remained open and impervious to ever being fully subdued. Canton continues to be the gateway of knowledge and learning, and has become the tech capital of the nation, with the cities of Shenzhen and Guangzhou earning the nickname the Silicon Valley of China. It is through this untamable spirit that Canton was able to become the cradle of the wild idea to end over 2 millennia of dynastic rule and bring China's political system into the modern era. So while the North has, for most of history, been the political and cultural center of China, it is without doubt that China would be a very different place today if not for its unlikely lead character, Canton. Thanks so much for watching, but listen, while I enjoyed making this video, it's a tremendous commitment of time and effort as I'm a one-man show. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing so I can continue making more content.